Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has been holding talks with European leaders and officials as she tries to convince them to help rescue her Brexit deal after today's vote in Parliament was called off. She's been to the Netherlands, Germany and is tonight in Brussels, where the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, told her that there was no room for the withdrawal agreement to be renegotiated. Theresa May was given the same message in Berlin by the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. The Prime Minister wants assurances about the backstop, which is intended to prevent checks on the Irish border if there's no trade deal with the EU. Tonight, she said they were just at the start of discussions. Our Europe editor Katya Adler reports from Brussels.
The Prime Minister's breathless whistle-stop tour today to see a number of European leaders seemed to them rather surreal. Under attack at home, Theresa May came to the EU appealing for more.
Whatever outcome you want, whatever relationship you want with Europe in the future, there's no deal available that doesn't have a backstop within it. But we don't want the backstop to be used, and if it is, we want to be certain that it is only temporary. And it's those assurances that I will be seeking from fellow leaders over the coming days.
The EU tried hard to extinguish expectations before the Prime Minister arrived. No rewriting of the Brexit deal, they insisted. Although
there is no room whatsoever for renegotiation. But, of course, there is room, if used intelligently, is room enough to give further clarification.
But if she comes back home with clarifications alone, is that enough to help the Prime Minister? Maybe, if the EU agrees to make them legally binding, as some in the Cabinet now suggest.
But EU leaders are wary about making too many compromises for the Prime Minister. They worry whatever they're willing to give her won't be enough to get the Brexit deal disliked by so many back home through the House of Parliament.
Some MPs are pushing for the Prime Minister to play hardball with the EU, especially over the backstop, that Irish border guarantee.
France wouldn't accept it, Germany wouldn't accept it. Why in heaven's name should we accept it? We need to risk the money. We just say to the EU, OK, fine, it's not all one way, not what we want. What do you want? You want 39 billion, you want access to our markets? Great, that's coming off the table, by the way, in case you didn't recognise that. And we need you to start being serious.
But ever felt you were pushing hard against a closed door? This was the Prime Minister on her arrival in Berlin today. Big smiles followed, but no big breakthrough.
I can't imagine how we can substantially change anything already negotiated in these tough negotiations, which were hard for all EU countries, as well as the UK. We're not cold-hearted, but at the end of the day, decisions have to be taken in London now.
The Prime Minister had faint hopes in the Dutch at least today. Mark Rutte is very close to the UK when it comes to trade. He has a lot to lose in the case of a no-deal Brexit. He also provides encouraging precedent. 2 years ago, he got legally binding clarification on a text the EU said was closed. But there was a catch. He had his country's parliament behind him, something Theresa May certainly doesn't.
If she thinks people are going to back down just because she seeks to blackmail them, running up against a time constraint, I think she's very wrong there. And anyhow, many of us are now convinced that no deal is better than this bad deal.
This evening, the Prime Minister is in talks with the President of the European Commission and the European Council. Preparations have already started here in Brussels for an emergency Brexit summit they've called this Thursday. More fanfare, more black cars, more red carpets. But no sign yet of a clear way forward. Katya Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
Let's go to Westminster now. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg is there, and speculation continues about whether the Prime Minister can survive this. What is the mood there tonight?
Sophie, you can probably hear things are pretty testy down here tonight. There are rival protesters, those demanding Brexit should happen immediately, and those pushing for another referendum have been engaged in some quite fruity exchanges between each other. And in a sense, that sums up the mood. Things are very, very febrile. The Prime Minister may well have made a logical political decision to delay the vote to avoid a huge defeat tonight, which is what she was staring at. But that has driven some MPs on her own side absolutely crazy. Some of them are furious at the Prime Minister's handling of this. And even those who are worrying about this more in disappointment than in anger question what the point is continuing down this path, looking for tweaks and clarifications to a deal, when it seems at the moment that unless there's a fundamental change, well, this deal is never going to get it through Parliament. But there are still those who believe that the Prime Minister does have a chance if she can get something that she can sell that sounds like it does toughen up the controversial parts of a deal. And the fundamentals, truths of this situation also haven't changed in a different way. There is still no agreement in the Conservative Party over an alternative plan that would get enough people on board. There's still no agreement in the Conservative Party over who would be a best person to lead them and the country out of this mess. And there's still no determination from the Labour Party to push forward to a no-confidence vote that might actually, at some point, bring the government down and force some kind of conclusion to this. So right now, it's not just the Prime Minister who seems to be in a trap, but frankly, the whole of Westminster. In this situation, almost even like the controversial backstop itself, where no one party, no one politician can find a way out on their own.
Laura Kuensberg, our political editor, thank you.
So Theresa May's attempt to save her Brexit deal has taken her on a whistle-stop tour of Europe. Tonight, she's in Brussels to see the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. Her day started with breakfast with the Dutch Prime Minister in The Hague, followed by lunch with Angela Merkel in Berlin. But the message from them all has been that there is no room to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement. Back in the House of Commons, furious MPs debated the delayed vote, with more calls on the Prime Minister to resign. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this.
Theresa May arriving at the German Chancellor's office in Berlin. Maybe this is a lock she could get for number 10. When they finally got to speak, the German Chancellor confirmed the withdrawal deal could not be renegotiated. Back in Westminster, MPs were debating a motion condemning Theresa May for delaying the vote on her deal that should have been happening right now.
Mr. Speaker, our Prime Minister is traipsing around the continent in pursuit and search of warm words when she can get out of the car to hear them.
At breakfast in The Hague, the Dutch Prime Minister repeated the message, no renegotiation. She got the same message from the European Commission President this evening when she got to Brussels.
There is a shared determination to deal with this issue and address this problem. And I'm going to be seeing the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar tomorrow.
At most, EU sources say she could get a document underlining how the backstop plan is meant to be temporary, how both sides must negotiate hard to avoid it coming into use. There could even be a target date for a new trade agreement.
If she can demonstrate with a certain degree of, let's say, not a guarantee maybe, but a likelihood, a high degree of likelihood that it would carry a majority in the Parliament, it would lead to the approval and ratification of the deal, yes, maybe these kind of ideas could be contemplated. But we are not there yet.
And while Theresa May was pleading for language to help her sell the deal, her pro-Brexit rebels were threatening back home to trigger a vote of no confidence in her as party leader, saying they were close to the 48 letters required to demand that vote.
The Prime Minister has now reached the cliff edge of resignation. I believe that she may well have to resign, and yesterday's events and running away from the vote and then off to Germany, Holland and the EU was yet another humiliation for the United Kingdom.
I noticed that a lot of people in the last 2 days have all been saying that's it. This performance yesterday wasn't good enough, and
she could be out of the country on one of these trips at the moment, and the letters could reach 48.
I think you have to assume that there is a possibility that that will be the case.
Tensions were raised tonight on the campaign barricades outside Parliament.
You're not British! You're not British anymore!
Inside, one former cabinet minister raising the idea that this might be a moment for a government of national unity to take power.
Maybe it's time for some sort of government of national unity. Maybe it's time for a free vote in an eventual vote on the deal, avoiding usual party political constraints.
There was a cross-party press conference in support of another referendum on Brexit. Some in this campaign worry that Theresa May's delaying of the vote on her deal could kill off their chances of testing their strength in the Commons. If you're not one of those hardcore Tories who backs coming out of the EU with no deal at all, then there are probably four main options on the table for you. You could back Theresa May's deal, back a general election triggered by a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons, back Norway Plus, that's Britain staying in the single market and the customs union, or back a second referendum, this time with a different question. Today was meant to be the day that Theresa May's deal probably crashed to a thunderous defeat in the House of Commons, taking it potentially off the table. Tomorrow or Thursday could have been the day that the option of a general election through a vote of no confidence was tried and foundered. With those two options off the table, and Labour MPs having honoured their conference pledge, Tory MPs having honoured their leader, it was thought many of those MPs could swim towards one or other of these proposals. But the other two proposals are still on the table, blocking any consideration of the last two. You want that option, the general election one, off the table to break up, to loosen up the factions that are
there is an
locked
argument
into
for a
parties
no
at the moment.
confidence motion on the grounds that the government has lost all authority. But actually, you're quite right that we do need that off the table, and we do need to move very quickly to the issue about having a people's vote. It needs planning.
The Labour Party conference motion was very clear that their first desire, their first option is to go for the general election, the vote of no confidence, and if that fails, then to move towards a people's vote. I think our concern is that we're running out of time, that the government is clearly, basically, I think, trying to get us to as close as we can to the end of March and then just present us with no deal or her deal.
Are you ready? Unison, I think. Yeah, so here we go.
Watching.
It's not
MPs giving a preview of a charity carol service tonight. If the vote on the deal had gone ahead this evening, this would have been in jeopardy. Few MPs you talk to seem to think Theresa May will come back from her travels with many other real gains. As we were saying there, this was around about the moment when the defeat would have been inflicted on the deal. Not just potentially, as Downing Street clearly calculated, killing the deal for good, but maybe even wiping away Theresa May's premiership with it. By delaying that vote, they have not wiped away those threats. They both still loom. And all the talk amongst very history-conscious Tory MPs tonight is of that moment back in 1990 when Margaret Thatcher was abroad in Paris, as it happens, and the lethal blow that was to bring down her premiership was inflicted. Theresa May is out of the country for trips to Dublin and Brussels for the rest of this week, and many people are wondering if there will be echoes of history. Labour, as I was saying in that piece, don't want to move yet for a vote of no confidence in the government because they're not convinced it will be won. They think the smaller parties that are trying to force that on them right now are doing it for their own purposes because they kind of want those other options that we were talking about and want those to be properly in play. And as for what Theresa May is actually going to come back with, I think the opening remarks, all the signs from the capitals around Europe that she's gone to and which have been uttering things today, that she is going to come back at best with words, not with real changes. Her troubles are still very, very much with her.
Gary Gibbon. Well, now, earlier I sat down with the Leader of the House of Commons, Andrea Leadsom. I put it to her that it was quite extraordinary for the government to have pulled the vote at the very last moment after months of negotiations.
Well, the Prime Minister took the decision yesterday morning, having spoken with Cabinet colleagues on the phone, because she has listened to the last 3 days of debate. People have been very clear with her, united around this one major concern about the risk of the UK being stuck permanently in a backstop.
But they were clear with her long before that. They've been clear with her for weeks.
Well, but the actual debate has been taking place over the last 3 days. There are 2 more days to go. The Prime Minister has made clear she will go back to the EU. She will seek those legal reassurances that will put the UK Parliament back in the driving seat with that sort of democratic accountability for making a decision about a backstop. And it's right that she do that. I mean, she acknowledged herself yesterday in a 3-hour statement that otherwise the government was not at all likely to have won that vote. And it's not in the interest of the United Kingdom that we simply go and lose a vote. We needed to actually address the concerns, and that's what she's determined to do.
She was running into losing a vote for weeks and weeks, and you just wouldn't wake up to it.
Well, I don't think that's true at all. I think what the Prime Minister's been seeking to do...
Not true. There were people thoroughly lined up against her and in large numbers.
There have been people absolutely expressing their concerns, and the Prime Minister has been speaking with people. She's been talking to businesses, touring around the whole of the United Kingdom. And that yesterday morning was her decision, was that she needed to go back to the European Union. That is actually a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. She was determined to deliver a deal that Parliament can support.
Well, you heard what the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said. There is no renegotiation. So all that can be is clarification.
Well, that's not strictly true, is it? I mean, the EU has formed for last-minute negotiations, and indeed, in that same interview, it was said that there can be clarifications and there can be better understandings. The Prime Minister could,
clarification is not renegotiation.
No, but there could, for example, be an addendum to the withdrawal agreement, so part of the legally binding agreement that sets out that the UK Parliament can vote, should it become necessary to consider entering the backstop, which we don't intend or expect to happen, that UK Parliament would vote. And it could also be the case that every year thereafter UK and EU Parliaments could vote to extend it if necessary. That's the kind of thing the PM would be looking for.
What this has done is to bring politics into disrepute, bring the Commons that you lead into disrepute, the Prime Minister into disrepute, and indeed the government into disrepute. I mean, where are we? This is the worst of times anybody can remember on the political stage.
I think the key thing here is that all of the opposition amendments to the meaningful vote do nothing to propose a solution. All they do is argue for the rejection of what the government is seeking to achieve. We cannot mess about.
But why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? It's because, in fact, what's been done is a mess of pottage. It's not a proper offer.
No, it is a proper offer. There is a fundamental problem, which is this issue of the permanence of the backstop. But to be clear, the opposition are not offering solutions. They are offering parliamentary pantomime, where they all run around jumping about saying that this isn't good enough, but without any solutions.
Andrea Leadsom, this is not just the opposition, it's your party. In fact, it's your party more than anybody else. They're the noisiest.
This is a vital decision for the United Kingdom. The legal default position is that we leave the EU on March the 29th, 2019 without a deal. The only way that that changes is if we have a deal that Parliament can get behind.
Andrea Leadsom, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, the woman who will effectively decide whether any vote of confidence in the government is successful is the Democratic Unionist Party leader, Arlene Foster. I spoke to her a few minutes ago and began by asking her, if the Prime Minister cannot change the withdrawal agreement, when is it time to change the Prime Minister?
Well, she's very clear as to where we are in all of this. We have said for some time now that the withdrawal agreement with the backstop is not an acceptable document because, of course, it creates a whole new range of issues for us in Northern Ireland. We will be subject to EU customs rules. We will be subject to the single market in a way that the rest of the United Kingdom will not be. And therefore, a withdrawal agreement with the backstop will not fly as far as the DUP is concerned.
You now hold all the cards. You can get rid of Theresa May if you want. At what point do you think it is time to change the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think that's right. I mean, it's a matter for the Conservative Party as to who they have as the leader of the party. We want to see a Prime Minister who will stand up for the United Kingdom and who will protect the economic and constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, and I hope that is what she will do, and certainly that's the message I'll be giving to her when I meet her tomorrow afternoon.
If there is a confidence vote between now and whenever she brings a deal back to the Commons, how will you vote?
Look, we're focused on trying to get rid of the backstop in the withdrawal agreement. We're not focused on internal matters in the Conservative Party. That's a matter for the Conservative Party. What we want to see is a Brexit deal that works for the whole of the United Kingdom, and to do that, we have to get rid of the backstop.
Right, but what if Europe just refuses? What happens then?
Well, if Europe just refuses, then Theresa May has to consider as to whether she puts the deal back again, because clearly it is not going to get support in the House of Commons. Right across the House of Commons, there isn't the support for this deal, so therefore she will have to consider what to do.
I mean, nobody has said anything today in Europe that suggests they are prepared to reopen the withdrawal agreement. They are prepared to give further reassurances. Are you saying that will not fly?
Absolutely, we're saying that's not going to fly. Reassurances and tinkering around the edges are not going to be enough to make this withdrawal agreement sustainable. What we need to see is major surgery to the withdrawal agreement. I'm not surprised that Europe is playing hardball. I'm not surprised at all. But they have to realise if they want a deal, and we should look at it from their point of view as well, if they want a deal, then it has to be a deal that works for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Is accepting the backstop worse than accepting Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister?
Well, I have said in the past that the threat of Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister is not a real threat, because, of course, there are many things that have to happen for that to come to fruition. But certainly this backstop is bad for the United Kingdom, it's bad for the Union, it's bad for the economic integrity of the Union as well, and therefore it's not something that we could support.
What's worse?
Well, I'm not going to get into false premises, because actually it's not a case of an either-or or a binary choice. But what I'm saying to you very clearly is the withdrawal agreement with this backstop in is very bad for the United Kingdom.
But hasn't what's happened this week demonstrated precisely why Europe needs a backstop? Because Theresa May cannot carry her own House of Commons.
Well,
it's very likely that any negotiations will fail.
The reason that we have been told there's a need for a backstop is to make sure that there's no hard border on the island of Ireland. Well, Brussels, Dublin and London have all said that they're not going to install a hard border on the island of Ireland. So I believe if there is to be any talk of guarantees, it should be in the political declaration around that issue and not in the legally binding withdrawal agreement, where it causes great problems for Northern Ireland in terms of constitutional and obviously in terms of the economy as well.
Do you believe a hard Brexit is now off the table?
I don't think there's a majority for a no-deal Brexit. I think that's what you're referring to. I think most people want to see a deal, but it has to be a deal that works for the whole of the UK and not just parts of the UK. And this deal, frankly, doesn't work for Northern Ireland, but I believe it's problematical for the rest of the United Kingdom as well.
And just finally, Sinn Féin are talking about a referendum to see whether Northern Ireland should join the Republic.
Well, there's nothing new in that. Sinn Féin talk about that ad nauseum.
Arlene Foster, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And welcome back to Brussels. By the way, that futuristic-looking egg over my left shoulder is the European Council building. That's where Donald Tusk, the President of the Council, has been huddled with Theresa May this afternoon. And after those talks, he said that they were long and frank. And frankly speaking, the word frank in Diplo language is not very positive at all. Now, quietly but seriously, governments in France, Germany and officials here at the EU Commission have been stepping up preparations for a no deal, a disorderly Brexit. This is the one scenario they had really wanted to avoid and actually still want to avoid. At the same time, they're beginning to wonder discreetly, if the whole thing might actually be called off because of a change of government or a second referendum. They will never say so publicly, but until recently, senior EU officials have been telling me privately that a second referendum was highly unlikely and frankly not even very desirable because it would open up new wounds. There are also some who have serious doubts about welcoming Britain to stay on in the EU as a potentially even more unruly relative. One thing is clear, though, from today. Pick your language, and the answer to opening up negotiations over the withdrawal agreement is non or nein. Or this morning from Jean-Claude Juncker, in plain old English, no. No more room for renegotiation.
But, of course, there is room, if used intelligently, is room enough to give further clarifications and further interpretations without opening the withdrawal agreement. This will not happen. Everyone has to know that the withdrawal agreement will not be reopened.
Another possibility, and that's why the heads of government are so important, is that Theresa May, or perhaps another Prime Minister, may want to ask for an extension of Article 50, But to do so, there has to be unanimous agreement from the other 27 member states.
Now, tomorrow, Theresa May travels to Dublin in the role of a supplicant, seeking concessions to appease her angry backbenchers. It's the first time a British leader has ever gone in such a role to a city where only a century ago the British state sent gunboats to enforce its will. Does this mark a new relationship of power on these islands, or is it a temporary blip of Brexit? We're joined now from Dublin by the celebrated writer Fintan O'Toole. And in your book, Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain, you look at colonisation and what part that's playing in this. Can you explain?
So it's a very strange phenomenon, isn't it, John, that in order to get to Brexit, you have to go through a mental process of imagining yourself to be intolerably oppressed by the European Union. Now, the European Union is open to a lot of criticism. I've given it a lot of criticism myself. But it's not an invading, colonizing force. Yet, you know, in this discourse that you've had, in England in particular, I think over the last 25 years, it's been imagined as such. You've had this kind of hyping up of minor irritations about regulations, many of them, of course, fictional, but you've had the hyping up of those into a notion somehow that Britain has been colonized by Europe, and that in a funny way, Britain didn't win the Second World War. It sort of ultimately lost it because the Germans, through the European Union, have insidiously taken over. It's a crazy, dark fantasy, but the ultimate grotesque irony of it is that if you start imagining yourself into this position of thinking of yourself as a colony, you kind of end up like one. So you end up with a deal that, while colony would be an overstatement, does in fact place Britain in a secondary relationship to the European Union. It's a sort of mad warning against being very, very careful what you fantasize about, because you may well end up with it.
Viewed from Dublin, how important is tomorrow?
Sadly, tomorrow is much less important than it ought to be. I mean, you're absolutely right what you said in your introduction about this being a unique moment. We've never had anything like this, where you effectively have a British Prime Minister coming to Dublin looking for an Irish government to bail Britain out of a very profound crisis. The problem is that, and I think this is not well understood in Britain, that there's actually not that much the Irish government can actually do. The Irish government will be very open to any kind of language in the political declaration that will make things a bit easier for Theresa May. The Irish are good at language, but I don't think anybody really believes that there's going to be enough language that's going to meet the demand for a legally binding commitment to undermine the backstop. An Irish government simply can't do this, and it can't do it because this is a vital national interest on the island of Ireland. We can't go back to a hard border and all of the implications that would have for the peace process. Theresa May herself, just last year in her Florence speech, said that avoiding a hard border in Ireland was one of the main demands of Britain in the negotiations with the European Union. You know, so this wasn't just an Irish thing. After all, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. But it's impossible for an Irish government to just sort of say that's over.
But this is deeply worrying. I mean, your analysis surely ignores the fact that, we have to keep repeating it, I guess, that this is the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world.
Absolutely, absolutely it is. And you know, the strange thing in a lot of the current talk about Ireland and Ireland being blamed for all of this is there is no country in the world that wants closer, more friendly relations with Britain than Ireland does. I'm sure you remember back, John, to 2011 when Queen Elizabeth came to visit Dublin for the first time in 100 years that a British monarch could actually come to the Irish state. And the atmosphere then was so wonderful. It was an absolutely, you know, joyous sense that all this dark history is over. We can get on with having a very normal relationship of close neighbours and friends who are intertwined. And Brexit really has thrown all of that up in the air. But it was always going to. I mean, from the very start, if you were watching it from here, you could see that there was simply no seriousness about addressing the Irish part of the Brexit problem. And it's the return of the repressed. If you don't acknowledge something, if you don't talk about it, you're going to end up with a problem.
Fintan O'Toole, thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you.
Wherever the Prime Minister went today at the start of her Brexit tour of Europe, the welcome was warm enough. The answer, though, to her appeal for help to get her Brexit deal through the Commons was the same: No way, Mrs May. It's not that the Dutch, the Germans and the EU itself are unsympathetic, but as far as they are concerned, the deal, as agreed, stands. Well, the Prime Minister is back in Downing Street now, having detected, she said, a shared determination to address MPs' concerns over the Northern Ireland backstop. But tonight, events appear to be moving out of her control. The chairman of the Conservative Party's backbenched 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, will meet Mrs May tomorrow. He's the man in charge of MPs' letters of no confidence in Mrs May. We will have more on that in just a moment. First, though, the reception she received in Europe today.
Stop 3 on a frantic, some might even say desperate, diplomatic dash across Europe. In a parallel universe this evening, she'd have been celebrating victory in her meaningful vote. Instead, she's pleading with leaders in Brussels for something, anything they can give her to stave off humiliation.
Whatever outcome you want, whatever relationship you want with Europe in the future, there's no deal available that doesn't have a backstop within it. But we don't want the backstop to be used, and if it is, we want to be certain that it is only temporary. And it's those assurances that I will be seeking.
Her meeting with Council President Tusk was described as long and frank, which in diplomatic speak may not augur well. At crack of dawn this morning, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte had jumped on his bike and pedalled over to meet her. It's fair to say no one had quite been expecting to be dealing with Brexit again today. The greeting from perhaps Britain's most sympathetic ally on the continent was warm, but little was on offer. Well, you can't refuse someone a cup of coffee, said the country's foreign minister, rather pointedly. By lunchtime it was Berlin and a red carpet hastily rolled out by German Chancellor Angela Merkel. If getting out of the European Union has been giving Mrs May problems, today she couldn't quite get out of her car. Door open at last, the message from the Germans, as relayed through their Europe minister, it's good to talk, but there definitely won't be any reopening of negotiations. At the European Parliament in Strasbourg, almost word for word the same from the Commission President.
There is no room whatsoever for renegotiation. But, of course, there is room, if used intelligently, is room enough to give further clarification and further interpretations without opening the withdrawal agreement. This will not happen.
In Berlin, they're happy to bring new clarification and interpretation, but the legally binding commitment on the backstop that many Tories are demanding, that won't happen. The language that may be possible, would that be political language or legal language?
We are politicians, we are policymakers, so we are talking in a political language, but I think it is intentionally by the leaders of Europe to find a solution.
If the British strategy is again to try and win concessions in other European capitals that they failed to win in Brussels, well, that's likely to be as unsuccessful as it's been throughout this 2-year Brexit process. They meet again on Thursday at a summit in Brussels, and Mrs May will once more be facing an EU27 who, on Brexit, speak with one voice. James Mates, News at 10, Berlin.
So with events moving quickly tonight, by the time Thursday's EU summit comes round, Mrs May could have an even more serious battle on her hands back home. There's that meeting we mentioned scheduled for tomorrow between the Prime Minister and the chairman of the 1922 committee. Not for the first time, some members of Jacob Rees-Mogg's European Research Group are claiming to have enough letters of no confidence for there to be a leadership challenge to Mrs May.
The Prime Minister left Brussels this evening after that cool reception in Europe.
What kind of reassurance did you get?
And her homecoming won't be much warmer either, returning to London to be told whether the threshold has indeed been reached to trigger a confidence vote in her leadership.
Prime Minister, reports tonight that the ERG says there are enough letters to trigger a no confidence vote on your leadership. Have you been told? And if so, what are you going to do about it?
No, what I've been doing here in Europe over the past day is actually doing what I promised Parliament that I would do, which is to speak to other leaders in Europe about the concerns Parliament have raised about the backstop.
The Prime Minister didn't want to talk about it, but others in her party did, suggesting the long-promised leadership challenge is close.
I do detect that in the last 24 hours, people have decided that this isn't going to work out at all. And I have heard from a number of colleagues, I can't name them now, that they were people that wouldn't have put letters in are now openly saying, do you know what, my letter's going in.
To trigger a confidence vote, Tory MPs must send 48 letters or more to Sir Graham Brady, chair of the Backbench 1922 committee. Theresa May is the first person he would notify if that number was reached. A secret ballot would then be held within a matter of days. Mrs May would need to win a simple majority to keep her job. That means 158 Tory MPs backing her. If she wins, there can't be another leadership challenge for a year. If she loses, she'd have to resign.
We need to resolve this issue now, and now is the moment to address this issue of confidence in our leader, and obviously giving my colleagues a little nudge to say, please get your letters in if you agree.
Earlier, the Prime Minister had been mocked in the Commons for pulling tonight's vote.
This runaway Prime Minister is not even seeking to negotiate. She confirmed she's only seeking reassurances. Mr Speaker, our Prime Minister is traipsing around the continent in pursuit and search of warm words when she can get out of the car to hear them.
In her party too, even in her cabinet, real pressure for the Prime Minister to come back with something substantial.
She has to now address this outstanding issue of being stuck permanently in a backstop. She's heard and listened to colleagues who've set this out, and she's determined to renegotiate it.
Though she has to win round like the DUP, who she relies on for support, give her zero chance of doing that.
I think all she's doing is buying herself a bit of time or trying to save a bit of face, but she's still got to face the House of Commons, and I think when she comes back with these meaningless reassurances, the same vote will happen, whether it's in Christmas Day, New Year's Day, sometime in January, who knows.
The government confirmed a vote on the deal will be held before January the 21st. But as the Prime Minister returned to Downing Street tonight, it's by no means a given that she'll remain resident here for that long. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, alongside me here, our political editor, Robert Peston. What do you know?
So, I should start by saying I hate this story more than any other on the planet because it combines rampant speculation by overexcitable Tory MPs and a process for triggering a vote of confidence or no confidence that is less transparent, more secretive than the process of choosing a pope. But what I do believe to be the case, having spoken to senior Tory sources, is that Graham Brady, who collects the letters and therefore triggers the vote, hasn't quite got the threshold of 48, but I think it is close. I know that he has asked to go in and see the Prime Minister tomorrow. Now, he does see the Prime Minister pretty regularly, but it's a pretty odd coincidence, given that so many Tory MPs think that a no-confidence vote is looming, that he has asked to see her. Of course, if tomorrow morning extra letters don't go in, there won't be this vote. But I think there is a very, very reasonable chance that tomorrow, this moment that we've had Tory MPs getting us ready for weeks now, will finally happen, that her authority will be put on the line. So then there is the second question, which is, if there is this vote of no confidence, will she get enough support from her MPs to stay in office? She has to get 158 votes, half the Tory party, to stay in office. She has made clear that even if she gets over 100 votes against her, she will not regard that as a failure and she will fight on. And, you know, the truth is, it's very hard to read, because whenever I see Tory MPs, and I've seen, I don't know, tens and tens of them today, I cannot find a Tory MP who's got a good word to say for her. They are absolutely furious with the deal that she's negotiated. They are furious that she pulled the vote on the deal. But when you then say, well, which of you could do a better job than she's doing, there's quite a lot of scratching of heads and there's a lot of disagreement. So I think because there is such pent-up anger, I think there probably will be a leadership challenge, but I can't guarantee it.
Deep breath. Robert, for the moment, thank you. I know that you'll be tweeting to anything further you find out.
Follow me on Twitter, follow me on Facebook, follow me on itvnews.com. It's all there.
It's all there, Robert. For the moment, thank you very much indeed.
We'll cross the channel in a moment to explore Theresa May's hasty trip there today. But let's begin the programme by getting the latest on the increasing speculation about a possible challenge to Theresa May. We have been here before and nothing is confirmed. But multiple sources have told Newsnight they believe that threshold of 48 letters to Sir Graham Brady has been reached, the number needed to trigger a vote of no confidence in her leadership. So, could Theresa May be about to face such a vote in the coming days? Our political editor, Nick Watson, Downing Street. Nick, what are you hearing? What's the latest?
Well, in the last hour, Kirsty, the Chief Whip, Julian Smith, went into Downing Street. The Prime Minister is back from her tour of the continent, so they are obviously having a meeting, and I think we know what they're talking about. You may, if you're lucky, in the next few minutes, see the Chief Whip actually leave Downing Street. Now, I've spoken to multiple senior Tories who tell me it is their firm belief that the 48 letters have reached Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, and that would be enough to trigger a vote of confidence in Theresa May's leadership of the Conservative Party. One minister said the letters are in. A former cabinet minister said to me things will definitely move around about lunchtime tomorrow. Now, in the last few minutes, Owen Paterson, the former Environment Secretary and Northern Ireland Secretary, has published in the Daily Telegraph his letter to Sir Graham Brady, and he makes these rather pointed points. He says that the Prime Minister has failed to prepare for no deal. He says that under the Prime Minister, the UK's negotiations with the EU have been like a feeble and unworthy supplicant. And he says that it is the Prime Minister who is the blockage to what he believes is a sort of a Canada-style free trade agreement. Now, the intervention by Owen Paterson is significant because it's just a few weeks ago that he walked up and down this street for a meeting with Theresa May in Downing Street to talk about his ideas of how you could resolve the issues over the Northern Ireland border with technological solutions. He is, it should not be forgotten, a former Northern Ireland secretary. Now, Owen Paterson, as I understand it, talking to friends of his, felt that Theresa May just dismissed his ideas out of hand when he questioned her in the Commons yesterday, where the Prime Minister said, yes, I'm going to go on a tour of EU capitals, but essentially her deal was the only game in town. One of his friends says, there it was again, nothing has changed. And another friend of Owen Paterson said the Prime Minister yesterday really just was treating Parliament with contempt. So what did she expect?
Nick, thanks, and I know you'll stay with us in case anything else happens later in the programme, and we are indeed going to be discussing that Owen Paterson letter earlier. But first of all, on the process of what might happen, you talked about lunchtime tomorrow being key, but on the process of what will happen next, what do you think might happen?
Well, it's important, Kirsty, as you say, to say that nothing is officially confirmed. But if those 48 letters have reached Sir Graham Brady, then he will tell the Prime Minister first and then tell the nation that there will be that vote of confidence in her leadership. Now, what she needs to do is get 50% plus one of the 315 Conservative MPs, which by my maths means that she needs 158 votes. If she does that, she is Conservative Party leader guaranteed for another year. If she doesn't get it, then there will be a leadership contest. She will not be a candidate in that contest, and that will take place over 2 rounds. The first will be in Parliament, and I think you could expect there will be multiple candidates, lots of Brexiteers, lots of Remainers, and lots in between. They would then be whittled down to 2, and they would go to the Conservative membership. Now, there are some Conservatives that are saying that had this confidence vote taken place a month ago, Theresa May would probably have won. But there's a feeling that things have moved on, and because there's a very real possibility that there could be a general election quite soon. One thing that Conservatives are absolutely united on is they do not want Theresa May leading them into the next general election. And there are a lot of Tories saying that, you know, sending the letters to Graham Brady is a sort of a semi-public act. Putting a cross and saying, I don't have confidence in Theresa May, is a private act. And you may well find there'll be a lot of Tories, a lot of possible cabinet ministers will say that's enough Theresa May. Others are saying no. They believe that she would make a case to the 1922 and she wouldn't win unanimously, but she'd do enough to stay on.
Nick, thanks very much. And as I said, you're going to be staying on in case anything develops tonight. Well, Damien Green is here, the former First Secretary of State and a close ally of Theresa May. Good evening to you, Damien Green. How do you think it's looking tonight? Do you think the letters are there?
I've no idea. I mean, until Graham Brady speaks, he's the only source that matters on this. I think if people have written letters to this degree, if their 48 letters are in, I think this is an act of monumental self-indulgence. People outside the Westminster bubble will be looking at this thinking, we've got a Prime Minister doing really difficult negotiations at the sharp end of one of the most important decisions this country's taken for 50 years.
But people, you hear what Owen Paterson said, not doing them well, and in the last week things have moved. You've got Remainers apparently considering. I mean, what would you say to a Remainer who's considering poised with a pen in his or her hand?
Well, don't, because as I say, we are at the stage, the Prime Minister has actually been abroad today talking to people. There are still negotiations to be had at the Council this weekend.
Have you spoken to her? Have you spoken to her in the last few days?
No. But what people watching will think is this is not what should be happening, that it's really important matter for the country, not just the Conservative Party, but the country. To undermine a Prime Minister at this stage seems to me to be wholly wrong.
And what do you make of the argument of people saying, well, actually, we're not undermining her, she's not being undermined at this stage. Actually, there's a lot of shooting herself in the foot in the way that she's handled the negotiations, the way that she's corralled information, as Owen Paterson said in his letter.
Well, I think that the fact that, for instance, Dominic Raab took over from David Davis as Brexit
and felt the
Secretary.
same, and felt he was shut out as well.
But he was there for long enough to do negotiations. David Davis did negotiations. I think that people need to step back and look at the bigger picture on this, of what we look like to our own people and what we look like around the world as a country. It cannot be sensible for somebody to say now is the time to try and get rid of the Prime Minister.
Well, you know Theresa May well. What will be in her mind tonight, seriously?
Well, she will have, as she always has, a huge resilience and sense of duty, and say she is doing her best to find a deal which is a good deal for Britain, and she's being undermined from within by people, frankly, some of whom are more interested in who is the next leader of the Conservative Party than they are about the future of this country.
I'm going to come back to you, but just very briefly, it was always said she was speaking in the nation's interest by her supporters, but in the last week it's felt more she was speaking in her self-interest.
Well, the only people who said that have been the opposition parties, and I think the other thing that, if colleagues are doing this, they should consider is that the person who will most benefit from this is Jeremy Corbyn, and no Conservative should want that.
Damien Green, thank you, and you're staying with us for later in the programme. Well, when Theresa May's car door jammed as Angela Merkel stood waiting, it was surely a metaphor. She's fighting for a solution on the Irish border that she can get through Parliament, but it seems she can't even get out of her car on her own. The Prime Minister, who Jeremy Corbyn dubbed the runaway Prime Minister, started the day looking for a sympathetic hearing from the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, then moved to Germany. And tonight she was in Brussels before she came back, insisting there was a shared determination among EU leaders to solve the Irish border problem, preventing MPs from backing her deal. But as they cannot unpick the withdrawal agreement, is there anything she can bring back that would change the equation, which right now points towards the death of the deal? Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is in Brussels.
In Brussels' Grand Place, the brewers have a splendid guild house and museum. Beer is taken seriously in this town, as is political process. Any big change, like Brexit for example, has to follow certain rules, fermenting over time to completion. Try to alter the recipe as it's being served up, and well, that's not something they take kindly to.
No, we cannot reopen this. Of course they can listen to her, but of course this process has been going on for 2 years. I mean, of course the first drafts were there about 8-9 months ago. But no, there is a draft on the table which was approved somewhere, first approved by the heads of state and government, say by the Commission mid-November, and then was there end of November. But we know that the work for the Commission was more or less done already in March or April. And then we were waiting for the Checkers report, and then came, say, the UK part, and then they came to a form of a acceptable situation for both sides.
At the European Union's institutions, preparations for a summit on Thursday have been unsettled by last-minute UK demands to revisit what was regarded as a done deal. As the EU runs into its councils or meetings of national leaders, there's a whole preparatory process. They like it to go smoothly. So the General Affairs Council, which has been going on here today, which is a meeting of the Europe ministers of the different countries, didn't even want to discuss the Brexit deal at all. As far as they're concerned, it's done and dusted. But what they are prepared to do is clarify its meaning a little. But there's no hiding the frustration at some of the political language coming out of Westminster.
Sorry, but there is no better deal you can get at this time. Because probably you remember a couple of years ago, there were many speculations that the EU is going to break unity at 27. EU didn't break unity, because we understand our common interest. And to have a delusional understanding that there can be last-minute concession is not right thing.
Theresa May tried anyway, starting the day in the Netherlands, then off to Berlin, where a smooth exit even from her official car proved problematic. She got cold comfort from Angela Merkel too, who told her the withdrawal agreement will not be changed, and then on to Brussels, where she met EU bosses. At best, they're offering simply to clarify the existing agreement, emphasising the positive.
Clarification means that by this point or by this article we mean what we mean. It's not like take it or leave it, but it is absolutely clear that when the European Council decided on 25th of November that it endorses the deal, that there is full understanding by all heads of state and government that European Union has made the final decision.
The 27 are also stepping up preparations for no deal. But if Brussels normally follows certain lines in moments like this, that includes avoiding great economic self-harm. And Britain's crisis is already causing some here to talk of a pause in Article 50.
Everybody starts to see that within 3 months this won't be done. And everybody will have to realize that to avoid a very chaotic cliff edge Brexit, you have to try to do something about this, that this is not happening, because this will be bad for both sides. I think Brussels will be mostly concerned about that and on the disruption which will be caused on both sides of the channel of a very chaotic Brexit.
So the Brussels Brexit recipe may well be brewed by traditional diplomatic methods, but allowing us Brits more time in the hope that we get used to its taste.
Well, Damien Green is still with us, and joining us from Strasbourg, Philippe Lambert is a Belgian MEP, a member of the Brexit Steering Group and co-chair of the Greens European Free Alliance Group in the European Parliament. Just before we talk about Brexit, Philippe Lambert, we should obviously very briefly say that you are at home. The Parliament is in lockdown, but tell me, what's the impact of what we now think is a terror attack on Strasbourg tonight?
Well, the whole city centre has been closed off and fenced by the police. Actually, the Parliament's building has also been sealed off. I was actually outside in neither of the two sealed off areas, so I went back to my hotel, and that's where I am at the moment.
Now, Philippe Lambert, I know you're aware of what's swirling around Westminster tonight, but actually just dealing with Theresa May's visit to European capitals today, was there any point, do you think, in Theresa May making these, I would say, mercy dashes around capitals?
Well, I'm not sure that she could extract anything that would please the hardest of all the Brexiteers. The point is that I understand that that part of the Tory party would like to have a clear cut away from the European Union, which is made impossible by the existence of the Good Friday Agreement. And again, this is a constraint that is legally binding for the United Kingdom, so there's no way around it. And I'm afraid that no amount of diplomatic language can remove that constraint from the landscape.
If indeed Theresa May faces a vote of no confidence and loses it among Conservative MPs, does that actually alter anything about this deal? Could it alter anything about this deal?
No, because I think that any prime minister in the UK will be faced with exactly the same legal constraints as Theresa May. I think that she negotiated in good faith with the EU, and so did we, but we ended up given the constraints with the only possible deal.
Now, If there is a new Prime Minister, is it possible that there could be a pause in Article 50, in the withdrawal agreement, to allow a new Prime Minister to settle in, or would there be no point in that?
Well, I think that, well, it really depends what the new Prime Minister would want to do. If the purpose is to renegotiate the whole withdrawal agreement, I think that the answer will be a straight no. If the intention is to go back to the people and ask for their decision between the withdrawal agreement and remaining in the EU, I do believe that the 27 and the European Parliament will grant the extra time needed to perform that.
Thank you very much, Philippe Lombard. Just coming back, Damien Green, on the question, you just heard what Philippe Lombard said. There was really no point in Theresa May going around Europe. She might get assurances that there's nothing legally binding and an assurance. Everything that's legally binding is within the withdrawal agreement.
Philippe Lombard wasn't quite making that point. He was saying that there were people in this country who weren't going to accept any deal, and he's right about that. That's perfectly clear. When the Prime Minister announced the deal the first time, there were people 5 minutes later saying it was unacceptable. They hadn't read 500 pages by then. So I think that was a narrower point.
But the deal is the deal now. That's the point.
Well, the deal. I mean, there are always. I mean, we know how European negotiations work. There are always things you can do at the last minute, and often beyond midnight, as it were. They can stop the clock and things like that. And so we are clearly in the last phases of this deal, but there are always more assurances to be given. We know that the Irish backstop is the key issue that people care about. If we can all be assured that that backstop will end at a specific time, or preferably, obviously, never be used at all, then I think a lot of people would be happier than they are now.
But that assurance is quite different from anything that's legally binding.
Well, it depends what the language is in a text. If it's a protocol to the withdrawal agreement, that kind of thing can happen.
If Theresa May does fall, as it were, is it more likely that we'll head for a no deal?
I think that may be slightly more likely, but I think more likely still is another outcome I don't want. I think no deal would be disastrous, but I think a second referendum would be damaging, divisive. I think actually the most likely thing to happen, if we proceed down that path, is a second referendum and possibly no Brexit. And I hope people are considering that this evening as well.
Now, the whole question of whether or not there is any kind of assurance still does not solve the problem, as you say, of the backstop. The backstop is there if there is no deal, no trade deal in place. The backstop stays there for that whole time. That is not going to be given away by the 27. It just isn't. So you can go and seek assurances that it's not forever, but that's actually nothing that's legally binding about that, as I just said.
Well, I think what you want is an assurance that the backstop never comes into force. Nobody wants the backstop. We all know this. We all want a trade deal. Now, if we can have some kind of assurance that we'll get the trade deal, I mean, if we have no deal, then the problem isn't the backstop. Right. The problem then is, how do you have a border between the EU and a different customs territory?
If Theresa May comes back with absolutely nothing, just as David Cameron did all those years ago, if she comes back with absolutely nothing, she's not going to survive this issue.
Well, I don't think she will come back with nothing. I think we've heard some language from some of the leaders today that suggests
David Cameron thought that too. Look what happened to him.
Well, we then had a referendum campaign, but I think that everyone in Europe knows how serious this is now. Everyone wants a deal. Everyone would prefer a deal rather than no deal. So now is the time for people to act on that desire.
Damien Green, thank you very much. Philippe Lombard, thank you very much. Not quite everybody doesn't want a no deal. All this tumult makes a no deal Brexit more likely, as Philippe Lombard has just attested. But how would that happen? And the impact it would have here and in continental Europe is far from clear. And there's also the possibility, as we said, of a people's vote, which has been building ahead of steam across the parties, but by no means at the very top of the opposition. Before we talk to two politicians, one for a managed no-deal Brexit, the other for a second vote, David Grossman's been assessing the plans in place for a very sharp exit.
Getting our no-deal ducks in a row, it's a huge task. The government has published 106 technical notices about how businesses, individuals and public bodies can prepare. They've covered such areas as aviation safety and pet passports. If we look at the actions the government says it needs to take, in 56 cases it requires establishing new systems or processes. In a further 14, we need to create a new body or expand capacity in an existing one. In 51 notices, it says we need further legislation. In 27, it talks about negotiating agreement with the EU or individual EU countries. And in a further 13, the government identifies the need to negotiate new international agreements. And much of this, of course, needs votes to be passed in Parliament, which, as we've seen in recent days, isn't in a cooperative mood.
It is a big workload for Parliament. In terms of primary legislation, so bills going through Parliament, we think there are at least 3 bills that have already been introduced that need to be completed before March next year if we're going to be ready for a no-deal outcome. But then there's a huge load of secondary legislation, statutory instruments underneath that, around 700 according to the government minimum, and they've only introduced around a third of those since earlier this year. So there's still a lot more to be done and the time is rapidly running out.
And then there's the technology. As we've seen in countless government IT projects over the years, knowing what needs to be done is not the same as getting it done. The government has identified 55 new IT systems that will be needed in the event of no deal. 12 are critical IT systems at the border. According to a National Audit Office report at the end of October, 11 of the 12 are at risk of not delivering by the 29th of March next year to acceptable quality. Much of the no-deal preparation required, though, is out of the government's hands. It's up to businesses to change the way they work to fit in with any new arrangements. But many businesses, like this dairy I recently visited in Omagh, are holding off spending any money on costly changes until they know it's definitely required. But how are other EU countries doing?
I think there's a clear difference in terms of how open the other governments have been. So the Dutch government, the Irish government have been thinking about this for a long time and telling people what it might mean. The European Commission itself as well started publishing notices on what no deal could mean back in the spring. And it was only in August, late August this year, that our government did the same. So, and then when it has been communicating, the quality of communication, the sort of clarity of information provided has been much greater in certain other member states than here.
So will all these tricky ducks be in a row by March? The PM assured us today that the government will step up preparations. But in politics at the moment, chaos and a flurry of feathers are never far away.
David Grossman, well, John Redwood, a staunch Brexiteer who supports a managed no deal, is here, and we're joined by Kirsty Blackman, the SNP spokesperson for the economy. Good evening to you both. Before we talk about your managed no deal, I must say, because it's all over the front pages tomorrow, the idea is there may well be 48 letters in which would trigger this vote of no confidence. Would you be pleased to see that?
Well, I'd like to talk about the managed no deal, because that, I'm sure, is what is more interest to your audience.
But it would be interesting for the general public, I think.
Well, I'd be very happy to talk about a vote if we're having a vote, but I'd like to hear from Sir Graham Brady, and then if you want to interview me on another occasion, I'm happy to do that. But you really mustn't stop people learning about what the regime will look like on the 30th of March if we leave on the 29th, because that is what Parliament has legislated to achieve. And I think there have been outrageous scare stories run by the media without any proper cross-examination of why these people say these things.
Is it more likely, do you think, if Theresa May's not there, that there will be a no-deal Brexit, chaotic or managed, whatever?
Well, I'm not speculating on Mrs May. I don't think it makes a lot of difference to this situation, because Parliament has expressed in full legislation that we are leaving on the 29th of March 2019, unless new legislation is brought in to delay or amend that proposition. So I think the government has always said it's preparing for an exit without any withdrawal agreement, and the withdrawal agreement is completely unacceptable to a very wide range of opinion in Parliament.
So what would a managed Brexit look like? Because there's talk of the border in Northern Ireland, the border with the Republic, the possibility
we have a border at the moment.
We could return to a hard border.
We have an excise border, we have an anti-terrorist border at the moment.
But we'll be out with the EU with no mechanism, no treaty. We'll have no treaties, we'll be outside the European Union era. The Republic of Ireland will be in it. The possibility is that even though the EU says it doesn't want it, and the UK says it doesn't want it, there could be a return to border controls. That is against the Good Friday Agreement.
The BBC will never let us explain how this can work perfectly well. And a very large number of people in the public don't believe these scare stories, and they believe business will find perfectly good ways of trading with the EU once we've left, just as we trade perfectly successfully with America and China at the moment without any free trade agreements. Now listen to me about the scare story. about how you won't get just-in-time components in, and that will upset the car industry.
Pharmaceuticals?
Well, let's deal with the car industry one, and what the government can do there, and what I'm recommending they do, is they say we won't have any tariffs on any imported components at all. So instead of there being more friction at the border, because of suddenly tariffs on an EU component, there'll be less friction at the border.
Can I just put it to
because we
you?
can take the tariff off the non-EU product coming in.
Matthew
This is a
Hancock,
new point,
Matthew Hancock,
which the
Health
BBC never
Secretary.
listens to.
No, Matthew Hancock, the Health Secretary, said people could die
Yeah, but
on
he's
a
wrong.
no-deal Brexit.
And
He is the
shouldn't.
Health Secretary.
But he's wrong. And I have asked questions about...
You say the
are
Health
there any-
Secretary, you know more than the Health Secretary about whether or
Well, let
not
me
people
explain
within
why.
the health service could be at risk.
Look, it's a good idea sometimes to let your guest explain their
Absolutely.
point of view, and then the public can judge whether we make sense or not. Now, I have asked the government questions, and they've assured me that there is no medicine supplier on the continent that is cancelling their contract or is saying they will not be able to supply goods after the 30th of March if we have left. And the reason why there shouldn't be a problem is that we run the ports, and we don't have to impose any new restrictions or complications if we need to get life-saving medicines
Thank you very
in.
much,
So
John
of course
Braidwood.
we're not going to kill people by doing this. This is quite wrong, this kind of scare story.
Let me just turn, well, that's your Health Secretary for you. Let me turn to Kirsty Blackman now. You are at the other end of the scale in which you don't want to leave the EU, but you want a people's vote. You've got about an hour to hear from Jeremy Corbyn that he is going to go for a vote of no confidence in the government. There's been dead silence. You can't go for one and guarantee you'll be taken because you're not the opposition. So you're stuck in limbo.
So what we said is that we would try and work across the parties, and that's what we've been trying to do. And in fact, actually, that's what we've been trying to do throughout this whole process. We've said from the beginning Brexit is bad, but we've also said if Brexit has to happen, we want single market and customs union membership. We've said that very clearly to the Prime Minister. We've reached out to Jeremy Corbyn and tried to make that case with him as well. In relation to the no confidence stuff, what we have done there is, again, tried to reach out, tried to say to the Labour Party, look, you need to support a vote of no confidence. Also tried to say to the other parties, the other opposition parties, it's the strangest thing that, you know, there's possibly 48 letters going in. The only people that currently have confidence in the Prime Minister are the Labour Party. It'd be quite helpful if they would actually consider their position here.
But you have no way of knowing whether Jeremy Corbyn is warming up to the idea of a people's vote, no matter how much other people in the party and very senior people in the party is. We've got no indication that Jeremy Corbyn, even though it was passed at conference, even though it's there, actually wants. And without that, you're scuppered and you have no power.
It would be really, really helpful if their front bench would move towards a people's vote, absolutely. And we need to keep making that case, and we will keep making that case.
But you put emotion in yourselves and it won't go anywhere.
In relation to a no confidence vote, that's distinctly possible, and that's why we're working so hard. But what they have said, and actually pretty clearly in media that I've heard them speaking in today, is that after the meaningful vote, that is the point in time at which they think a no confidence vote. I would rather they did it sooner, because the meaningful vote, goodness knows when that's going to be.
If you ended up in a general election, would you go into coalition with Labour?
I don't think that's not really a decision for me to take, but I'm not sure a coalition would be the thing that I would be going for at all.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, let's get back to that main news of the evening and look through some of tomorrow's front pages, which don't look good for the Prime Minister. I'm joined by The Spectator's political reporter Katie Balls and LBC's Ian Dale. First, let's take a look at tomorrow's headlines. And on the Mail, the vultures are circling. May brace for leadership battle with Labour MPs poised to trigger vote to oust her. The Telegraph, exactly the same. May facing her Brexit moment of reckoning. And then on the Guardian, a dash to Europe they've got, but May faces new threat at home. Wonder whether she will go and see Leah's article tomorrow. But as we speak, columns reacting to the latest breaking news are being written. But we do have Conservative MP Owen Paterson's letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister, which has just been published by the Telegraph, and Nick spoke about it earlier in our programme. The quote that we have picked out is, These mistakes have eroded trust in the government to the point where I and many others can no longer take the Prime Minister at her word. Ian, tell me about some of the mistakes he talks about in this article.
Well, he's talking about appointing Ollie Robbins to as a career civil servant with no business experience when the government had on hand a vastly experienced international trade negotiator, Crawford Faulkner. He points out that he thinks it was a mistake to create a new Brexit department only to keep 2 Secretaries of State so in the dark they had to resign over a policy one would have thought they were overseeing. But you can't disagree with much of that, can you?
No, and Katie, you know, Theresa May's never been one to have a group. You know, she hasn't got a base. She's not used to working with people, and clearly that was a massive problem, not for David Davis, for Gove, for Dominic Raab.
Yeah, she doesn't really have an inner circle.
No.
She has her husband, who she's very close to, and she used to have close aides who've now left. And I think you've seen that in the way that she's run her cabinet. Ministers don't feel consulted, and even when mistakes have been made and people have stepped in to keep the show on the road, they don't feel that they have been rewarded with responsibility. They feel that Theresa May has still cut them out. And I think slowly that has built up to this situation now where MPs from all sides of the Brexit debate are very dissatisfied with Theresa May as a leader.
And you know, it's actually not just you know the ERG now. It is Remainers we're hearing. They're sick to the back. And this last week has been the kind of straw that brought the camel's back.
She has united the Conservative Party in a strange way, in that they all find fault with this Brexit deal and the way that she's negotiated it. And I'm not sure there's a way back. Look, I think Theresa May has got a lot of affection within the Conservative Party, even amongst her colleagues to an extent. But in the end, you get to a point where you think, well, would it be better if someone else took over? But the problem with that is, any new leader is going to want to try to renegotiate the deal.
And we heard tonight that's not going to happen.
Well, and they may then have to extend Article 50. Yeah. So Theresa May's biggest argument in this confidence vote, if there is one, will be, well, stick with me because you might not get Brexit.
So, weighing up what you think is going to happen, do you think there'll be a no confidence vote?
Well, Tom Newton-Dunn, the political editor of The Sun, is fairly well plugged in, and tonight he's saying that no, the letters are not in. And yet everyone else is assuming that they are. Now, circumstantially...
And Laura Kunsberg, the BBC's political editor, saying she's speaking to senior
she doesn't
Tories
normally nail her colours to the mast without some sort of evidence. So if I was betting, I'd say they probably are in. But what happens if between now and tomorrow morning someone withdraws a letter?
Yes, well, what happens? But also, she's not there. I mean, because what happens, and then there is a vote of confidence among the Conservatives in the House, and she's got to get whatever it is, 581 votes.
No, 150.
150.
That would be
switching
impossible.
it right round. Switching it around. What do you think?
Well, I think the thing is, whether or not letters are in, it's clear there's a very feeble atmosphere, and we say that a lot, but I was struck today by the number of MPs, not on the Brexit Leave side of the debate, who were coming to me and saying, we are losing faith in the Prime Minister, and that's her problem. If she has lost faith on the Remain side and the Leave side, it gets difficult. That said, I still think there is a belief among the Cabinet that she could win that vote, that she could still sneak through, but what is the margin she'll win by? Because if it is a small margin, it does get very hard to say that she really has the backing of her party.
And also, what actually the Cabinet does, and figures in the Cabinet and ex-Cabinet are very, very important.
Well, if she has 100 Conservative MPs, a third of the parliamentary party voting against her, she's in difficult territory. If she has 120, I would say it's almost impossible. And then the Cabinet does come into play, because if the Cabinet say to her, sorry, the game's up, she would have to go. But, the timing of this is terrible, because when would the confidence vote be held? On Thursday, when she goes to Brussels? On Monday, when she's back? Would they then have if she loses, could they really then concertina a leadership contest in Parliament in those 3 remaining sitting days? The timing is awful. There is a school of thought, though, that if they do that, they could have the sort of country hustings just after Christmas and send out the ballot papers in early January. That would be really
so she stays on as a caretaker?
Potentially.
Well, she'd have to, yeah. Or David Lidington takes over.
About how they can do it from people who want her to move. And, you know, it's been suggested you could do a bit like speed dating, these fast rounds, because you have to do all the parliamentary rounds to narrow down the candidates. Yes. Only the final 2 go to the membership.
And is there going to be, I mean, there's so much dissent within the party itself about who should lead the party.
Yeah, and I mean, it's unclear that it's really going to solve any problem in new leader, because they will still have the same problems of parliamentary arithmetic, no Tory majority, and there'll still be a lot of Brexit divisions.
And tell me, what's Jeremy Corbyn's calculation? Because obviously has not responded to the SNP's call for the vote of no confidence in the government. What's he doing?
Well, I think this makes it less likely that he would call a vote of confidence because he would just let the Tories stew in their juice. But bear in mind, I identified 36 possible candidates to stand in this election at the weekend. I did a poll on my website. And it's not beyond the realms of possibility. There could be 10 or 15 that actually put their names forward.
Thank you both very much indeed. And of course, we're all in the realms of speculation at the moment. We will hopefully know more tomorrow.